You know, for one reason or another, well, honestly, only really one, I never really intended to redo any of my videos. Mainly because regardless of how different the content may be in said redone videos, it would still feel, in some way, like lost progress. Why would I do something I already did, again, when I could just work on something new? That said, after I finished the Slaughterhouse 9 video, I wound up looking through some of my old scripts. And while I was tempted to redo the Asian Bad Boys video or the Parahuman Classifications video, I was struck by how basic my Undersiders videos were. Now, it was likely influenced by how I currently make videos, but I remembered those videos having a lot more substance. Well, as it were, they were shockingly bare bones. Especially given how long these upcoming videos are going to be by comparison. Anyway, as you may have already read, I originally was going to make this one very long video, but plans change. Right. The Undersiders were a group of young thieves who mostly operated in Brockton Bay. During the earlier phases of their existence, they mainly did smash and grabs. Broadly speaking, they did missions that minimized contact. They wanted to avoid combat and only engaged in it as a last resort. That said, after certain events, they would actively draw more attention to themselves and more often get into conflict with heroes and villains alike. The Undersiders do not technically have a strict leadership structure. In theory, depending on the situation, someone would take control and direct the others based on who was most qualified. However, in practice, you could say that they had a quote-unquote triumvirate of their own. In many cases, I want to say most cases, leadership was given to Grue, Tattletale, and or Skitter. I'd say mostly because the other members could not be bothered enough to lead in the first place. Though, to be clear, regardless of the circumstances, unanimous or majority consensus was still something desired and preferred, especially when the group became more of a council of people dictating their own territories. With that out of the way, onto Grue, the one that can be ostensibly called the default leader of the Undersiders. To begin, Grue was a shaker and a stranger. However, due to certain events, he later also became a trump, but that came with a number of changes. So, for now, I will describe his power as it originally was. Grue's power allowed him to generate a smoky darkness that came out like, well, smoke. Its range was not specified, but with the clearest point of reference we have, it's potentially somewhere around 45 feet, or 13.7 meters, in length. I don't know how wide its radius could have been, and more importantly, I don't know how much surface area it could actually cover. Regardless, while the numbers I give may not be the most accurate, for one reason or another, we otherwise would have had more vague ranges, such as a big bank lobby or several streets. As it stands, it's the best we have. Now, the special properties of Grue's darkness are where things get interesting. First, the way it obscures sight is not simply a case of making things harder to see. It is not just very dark smoke. The darkness itself erased light. So anyone outside looking in or inside looking out will not be able to see anything at all. Second, in addition to removing the ability to see, it also muted sound, to the point that even your own voice was barely audible to yourself. Third, the darkness also hampered movement. It was, quote, like you're underwater but not floating. That, quote-unquote, underwater resistance was also inconsistent, which made smooth navigation within the darkness even more difficult. I will note that the effectiveness of those three things will vary depending on the person, and more specifically depending on the parahuman. For example, Grue's darkness interfered with certain breaker powers, notable ones being shadow stalkers and velocities. It could also nullify or counter certain powers, one being shadowbirds and possibly other powers that functioned in a similar way. So, besides disrupting one's senses and possibly powers, there are two other, let's say, auxiliary benefits worth mentioning. The overall less useful one was how the generation of the darkness itself created something akin to a steady air current around Grue. While it may not be strong enough to protect him from airborne pathogens and the like, it does wipe away his scent. And despite how I've initially described it, scent wiping is something more useful than one may, well, initially assume. Though, keep in mind that he could not wipe the scent of others. The other significantly more useful benefit was that it could obstruct more than just visual light and sound waves. It can also interfere more broadly with other forms of electromagnetic radiation, such as microwaves and radio waves. In fact, it could even block and/or dampen particle radiation. Keep in mind that I am unsure of the extent of Grue's darkness's ability to interfere with all forms of radiation. For example, since the darkness only severely dampened sounds, with her superhuman hearing, along with her ability to create subsonic beacons, Cricket was a parahuman that could, more or less, still function fine within the darkness through echolocation. With that in mind, to some extent, Grue's ability to interfere with light and radiation may not be total either. Though fair, that is just me contemplating things. Plus, it may be a case where the hypothetical limit is just too high to be worth considering, similar to how long Grey Boy's time bubbles last. Not to mention, Cricket was not exactly the best example either, since under that same line of reasoning, while it could theoretically be possible for some form of electromagnetic radiation, or even normal visual light to pierce or bypass Grue's darkness, it would probably need to be as specific of a situation as Cricket's, or be some sort of other extreme. Even then, I am doubtful of the latter, because if Grue was able to block Behemoth's radiation, I feel even if Purity was trapped in Grue's darkness, her light would probably not be able to overcome it. I suppose maybe Legend's light could, but he was an extreme of extreme examples, which Behemoth was too, so who knows. Anyway, before I move on to the ways he could use his power, I'll quickly note its weaknesses. One, I'd say for obvious reasons, movers generally had an easier time getting out of Grue's power. Two, Grue's darkness can be moved with strong winds. Finally, while not exactly a weakness, it is worth mentioning that his power does naturally fade away after around 20 minutes. Now, to quickly go over how he experienced his power. First of all, Grue could not see his darkness, but he was broadly aware of where it was. Second, he had a general awareness of when something was influencing his darkness and when something was in contact with it. Okay, while the following are likely not all that Grue could do, it should still give one a good idea of what he was broadly capable of. So, Grue can envelop himself in darkness, which served the purpose of projecting a more intimidating image. Said image at times included making his silhouette larger, making him even more intimidating. Said enveloping darkness also provided him with some ready-to-go darkness. Besides that, another one was Grue's ability to manipulate his darkness to form shapes. Said shapes were rough, but Grue could make convincing body doubles should the need arise. Granted, from what I saw, only in low-light conditions, but still. While still on the topic, he seemed able to only make around a dozen or so of said doubles, and/or shapes. More so, once formed and placed, he did not seem able to further manipulate them. While perhaps not the most interesting, Grue can dissipate his darkness at will. More importantly, he could dissipate specific sections. As such, if you take previous information into account, he can and did have more secure conversations, by enveloping his allies in his power and creating a darkness-free pocket within. Anyway, the final use I'll mention is how he could modify his voice to sound echoed, reverberated, and hollow, more abstractly described as, quote, like something alien and far away. I don't recall him being able to apply this effect to others, but do tell if he did. Now then, let's just say that at some point Grue experienced a second trigger, and as such that came with several alterations and additions to his power. Before I get to the big one, the Trump addition, I'll quickly go through the comparatively more minor ones. First of all, Grue's darkness became thicker and heavier. I can relate that to several things, but there are two I can specifically refer to. One was my initial assumption of it being related to the darkness itself being harder to move in. However, given how Grue himself described it feeling as slow or slower, it likely more so related to the fact that it became slower to generate, yet interestingly enough, quicker to spread. Even more likely given it was described post-second trigger multiple times as something akin to tentacles siding against and over one another. As for the other minor thing, it was just simply a case of Grue becoming more aware of where his darkness was. Alright. As said, the major change was the Trump aspect that gave him the ability to use the power of parahumans within his darkness. With caveats, since on its own it does sound fairly strong, to say the least. To start, he could only use one power at a time, but he could rapidly switch between powers, if need be, to partially mitigate that detail. Additionally, the relevant parahumans being borrowed from would also have their powers disabled. Note that the powers being taken were not exact copies of the originals. They were weaker for several reasons, but for my purposes I'll condense it down to two. In a practical sense, any experience, tricks, and or skills the original user may have developed and gained were not transferred over to Grue. In a more technical sense, Grue also did not acquire any secondary powers that may have helped in using the quote-unquote primary power. Typically, the additional powers he did not get were the thinker ones. And as such, Grue lost the background processes that would normally help in administrating and coordinating whatever power he got. As a point of interest, some of the protections that a power would normally provide to prevent and mitigate accidental self-death or harm may not have transferred over too. But, at least according to my notes, there does not seem to be clear evidence to prove or disprove this notion. Nevertheless, it is something to keep in mind. Now, related to all that, due to said issue with thinker powers, along with Tattletale's own educated guess, it tracks that physical-based powers worked better with Grue's Trump ability, while primarily thinker-based ones were significantly diminished. In that same vein, Tinker powers would also likely be as or more diminished. And as I see it, I think it makes sense. Grue's shard was copying what another shard was doing, and while copying a physical power may be easy enough, the mental-based ones are less so since those are ostensibly more intrinsically linked to the origin shard itself. To put it another way, though perhaps not the best way, you can copy the software, but if it isn't meant to run on the hardware it's put on, well, results may vary. And in the case of Thinker and Tinker powers, those relied more on the hardware, the passenger. I'm not going to do weaknesses again since they are basically the same post-second trigger, and any new weaknesses can be inferred, or were already included when I was going over the Trump stuff. However, since his darkness was heavier, there is something to be said that strong winds may not be as effective on his darkness post-second trigger. That stuff aside, what I will do is briefly describe how Grue experienced said Trump power. Essentially, Grue felt a quote-unquote circuit, a cord, or wire that connected him to those within his darkness. And if he focused, he can make that circuit quote-unquote bright and hot, and from there he gained access to a portion of someone's power. If you're wondering about the picking process, what determines which power is grabbed, to be honest, I don't know. Based on what I just said, it may seem like Grue had some capacity to pick, but as far as I've read, he could only feel and pull on the connection. He did not know what the connection gave until the link was established, and even then he only had a broad idea of what he got. Granted, most of the time it isn't that much of an issue, since even after second triggering, from what I could tell, he did not use that power stealing as a crutch to heavily lean on. Though fair, it was still nevertheless a useful tool he did use often in one way or another. I will say for grab bag capes like Glory Girl, there may be some issue. Between the flying, her aura, her invulnerability, and her strength, I don't know which one would be the quote-unquote primary one. That said, I admit I did not track down every instance of when Grue borrowed the power, so there may be an answer of some sort to that question somewhere. Well then, that was a lot of information, and truthfully I'm only mostly satisfied with how it came together. Nevertheless, let's continue on to Tattletale, the one that can be considered the constant second in command of the Undersiders. She was a thinker, and I've debated exactly how I was going to describe her power, and I concluded that I've been overthinking it. Suffice to say, Tattletale had enhanced intuition that allowed her to be very effective at gathering information. She could take a small but relatively related amount of base data and gain much more information than most normal people, allowing her to close gaps in knowledge that would otherwise take more time and/or people. That also made her good at cracking encryptions and later reading lips. From a more person-to-person point of view, her enhanced ability to understand her surroundings made her quite adept at quickly determining someone's general demeanor and attitude, which allowed her to play mind games, among other things. Most of the time to her benefit, but at times she did poke and prod a bit too much or prodded when it was best to just hush up. I will note before continuing that at first, Tattletale did find people difficult to read. They were a mixture of being too random, chaotic, and complex, though she did eventually find ways to better process lump sums of information. She also built up her mental fortitude. So as far as weaknesses go, there isn't too much. To start, even though she did get better at using her powers on people, it was still difficult for her to determine someone's deeper motivations, even harder when it related to someone's deeper emotions. More broadly, if she let her power run wild without focus, she received a large sum of junk information that could force her to restart her analysis. Suffice to say, she could not let her power act on its own and expect it to give information that she may want or need. She needed to consciously direct it for it to be effective. However, keep in mind that if she overused her power, she will get headaches, then migraines, and if she pushed it even more, she would get severe migraines that would lead to her power becoming temporarily disabled. Now, I think the most important thing to keep in mind, besides the latter, is that be it through inaccurate information, wrong information, or incomplete information, her power can be misled and manipulated. No matter what Tattletale says or does, her power is not infallible. To briefly mention a passenger-related thing, while it's perhaps not a weakness per se, Tattletale's passenger did, to an extent, compel her to antagonize people, and as noted earlier, while picking at someone's issues can be helpful, it can also cause issues of varying degrees for Tattletale herself and her allies. Well, I suppose that's all I have to say about Tattletale, so let's move on to the last member of the Undersiders' quote-unquote triumvirate, Skitter. Skitter, in basic description, was simply a master that controlled bugs. There were some other classifications that could be applied for reasons, but aside from master, tinker, and shaker, I suppose, any other classifications can be considered an overreaction, albeit one with some merit. Anyway, while bug control does not seem to be too complicated of a thing, it is evident that when going into the deeper details of her power, that it was not quite as simple as it may initially seem, as it tends to be for a lot of powers. Let's see. Skitter had a form of telepathy that allowed her to transmit and receive information to and from bugs. Said information involved things such as her bugs' location, biology, and general status, among other things, that I'll display here. The back and forth itself happened frequently and rapidly, functionally creating a real-time connection with little to no delay that helped facilitate a form of echolocation that painted a very detailed picture, which I will go into further detail later. Now, as for what bugs could be controlled, well, that's where we get into a somewhat complicated topic. Without getting into the scientific minutiae, what I meant by bugs in the context of her power was more so animals that people may consider or mistake as bugs, such as insects or more broadly other arthropods, among other things. To provide a clearer picture, some bug examples include crabs, lobsters, krill, spiders, scorpions, and centipedes. However, as said, she can control other animals that are not arthropods. Examples of that are snails, slugs, clams, earthworms, and heartworms. Evidently, that is a little all over the place, but to perhaps muddle things more, I'll note that I don't know how far the definition of a bug-like creature was stretched. For example, as you saw and heard, she could control some mollusks, but could not control cephalopods and octopi. On one hand, someone can state it's related to the relative intelligence of said animals, On the other, it's something related to her passenger that I'll, once again, get to later. That said, I will briefly mention that her passenger likely explained why she had some sort of size minimum on what she could control. She could not control skin mites and nematodes, for example. Somewhat related, but bug-like Case 53s and certain bug and bug-like creations of other parahumans are not controllable either. Before continuing, it's important to know that Skitter was a double trigger. She triggered back to back, so whatever I convey onwards will essentially be the best Skitter's power can be, barring outside parties getting involved and or specific contextual situations. It's not that important, but it helps put things into perspective. Without said double trigger, Skitter's ability to multitask and precisely control her bugs would have been significantly diminished, along with her range, complexity of orders she could give, and number of bugs she could potentially control. I will say this though, the double trigger likely saved her life, or at the very least kept her mentally stable. As in, it most likely made her capable of processing all the information she got from her bugs. Without that, in the worst case scenario, Skitter may have died from her brain overloading. In a less bad scenario, she may have ended up like Labyrinth in some way. Anyway, let's move on. To state the obvious, Skitter can force her bugs to act unnatural. That can range from quick commands such as injecting specific amounts of venom, or a simple go do this over there. Alternatively, there could be long-term commands, such as produce silk until physically incapable then repeat, or breed and multiply. Skitter could also push her bugs past normal limits. Though I don't exactly recall if that was a constant state of being while under Skitter's control, or if Skitter could selectively choose when to enhance her bugs. Granted, it could be both. That said, even with her level of control, there were certain ingrained instincts that could not be overridden, or at least overridden without constant attention. One such thing is just the natural deep instinct of certain bugs and insects to eat each other. Expanding more on the continuous commands specifically, unless told to stop, do something else, or until whatever order was completed, the bugs will persist with whatever they are doing without fail. Obviously, if they are taken out of her range or die, they will stop regardless of Skitter's desires. Related to that, depending on the nature of her commands, bugs in her range will persist in what they're doing even when Skitter is not consciously or actively directing them. That includes cases of quote-unquote sudden unconsciousness too, though commands given in the case of the latter may have different command parameters. I suppose another thing that goes without saying is that certain parahumans can disrupt her control. Anyway, to take some detours, the first I want to talk about is a concept I want you to keep in mind, not just for Skitter, but for other parahumans. Said concept is session ranges. It establishes that with certain high-stress situations, commonly situations that evoke similar feelings to one's trigger event, a parahuman's power will become stronger in some way, be it its range, versatility, responsiveness, or a combination of things. It can be a temporary phenomenon, but powers have been shown to improve, albeit slowly. So while the full effect may not stay, a parahuman's power may still be a little stronger after the fact. Granted, just because someone's power improved after experiencing a session range event, does not mean that their power improved due to said session range experience. You know the saying, correlation is not causation, and all that jazz. The second thing I want to get out of the way now are certain passenger details. Since it is relevant, I'll begin with session range related info. In such events, powers get stronger because the parahuman's connection to their passenger gets stronger. That much is obvious, I hope. However, the reasons why passengers give the power boost is most likely connected to two things. One is that it may be a defensive mechanism to increase the survivability of their host. The other is that it's potentially a way to subconsciously trick or train their host to seek conflict to get said power boost. In either case, a passenger can continue gathering data, be it due to their host continuing to live and or their host getting into situations that may force them to push the limits of their power. That said, there is nothing to say it can't be both or something else entirely. The other passenger-related information I wanted to convey is the thing I teased earlier about why Skitter's controllable minions are the way they are. To make a much longer explanation short, When Skitter got her power, her passengers surveyed Skitter's understanding and broader humanity's understanding of what a bug was or could be, and from that determined what bugs Skitter would be able to control. So, if certain creatures cannot be controlled, despite perhaps another related creature being controllable, it is because Skitter's passenger either determined it to not be a bug, based on the knowledge it analyzed, or did not find said creature worth needing to control for whatever reason. If you want a more extended explanation, refer to, I believe, the latter part of Breed's section in my Slaughterhouse 9 overview video. Okay, with those things out of the way, I'll start simple and talk about Skitter's control range. As a bit of a correction, I'll mention that when I did the Undersiders overview way back when, I stated that I was uncertain about Skitter's exact range, but as it were, I just wasn't as diligent with research back then. Now, while I am more confident with the upcoming information, I want to highlight that the ranges I'm giving are radii, and as far as I could tell, Skitter could not focus her entire end-to-end diameter range into one direction. That said, at the beginning of her career, her range was between 528 feet / 161 meters to around 600 feet / 183 meters. As time went on, her range increased, and eventually became around 900 feet, then 1500 feet, then 1800 feet, or alternatively around 274 meters, then 457 meters, then 549 meters. Though, due to session ranges, she did at one point get to around 1950 feet / 594 meters. Now then, I called Skitter's power a form of telepathy, but what does that actually entail outside of the various things I've already mentioned? Well, emotion manipulation, specifically on herself, is a good place to start. Basically, she could channel her emotions into her swarm, and in doing so would cause a variety of, let us call, secondary effects. One was that during times of stress, she may unconsciously bring her swarm closer to her. Another was if enough negative emotions were channeled into it, the swarm would act extremely agitated. In that same vein, if she channeled more general, quote-unquote, lower-level stresses and anxieties and whatnot into the swarm, an aura, let's say, of extreme calm would form around her. An aura that tended to trick others into thinking that she was much more put together and stoic than she was in actuality. In fact, that ability to subdue, intentionally or not, her body cues and broader physical reactions was so effective that even certain thinkers had difficulty reading her. Granted, even when not filled with extremely negative emotions and the like, if one knew what to look for and or was particularly observant, it was possible for someone to tell when Skitter was using her swarm as an emotion dump. Okay, while I will get to the more comparatively creative and interesting way Skitter used her power, I want to preamble all that by again expositing some related information to keep in mind. Specifically, how Skitter could more consistently and practically improve the effectiveness of her abilities. Simply put, the three to keep in mind are focus, bug variety, and swarm size. For the latter two, it's a case of more quote-unquote tools giving someone new ways to do things while also improving the things they've already been doing. Though I will say between the two, aiming for a larger swarm was probably more important, mostly because what Skitter generally did benefited more from more bugs. Not to mention, she ostensibly had a limitless ability to multitask, so as long as there were bugs in her range and as long as she could maintain whatever she had control of, she could accrue a larger and larger swarm to do things with. Bug variety was nice, but given the latter, Skitter was more than able to do well without. Better yet, if you're wondering about power overuse, as far as I know, she did not experience any backlash, at least in the way Tattletale did. Very fortunate. So, I realize focus is kind of a nebulous or vague concept to refer to. So to clarify, what I meant by that is how the potency and precision of Skitter's power was heavily linked to how much active attention she gave to something. For example, she could give a general command to get something from someone, but if she wanted to secretly, let's say, get keys from that someone, she could more directly control one or a few bugs to more carefully finesse said keys off of her target. Similarly, she could improve the sensory and vocal capabilities of her swarm if she's more actively there. Speaking of, let's get onto that. For the sake of neater organization, I'm going to divide up information related to Skitter seeing, hearing, and speaking to her bugs into 3 separate sections. Since it's the odd one out, I'll go over her bug speech first. How clear and human-like the sounds she generated depended on how many and what types of bugs she had control of. With a relatively smaller swarm, the speech that was produced tended to be stilted, missing consonants, and seemingly required additional effort to maintain and produce. In contrast, with a larger swarm, she seemed able to produce sounds that passed more as human. Though, from how I understood it, even with more passably human speech, there was still some degree of buzzing and chirping, by virtue of the fact that it was an assortment of bugs generating said speech. That said, if you can forgive the pun, it could be considered less a bug and more of a feature, a quote-unquote purposeful quirk to help disguise and or intimidate. Now, compared to the previous topic, Skitter's ability to hear and see through her bugs had much more of a learning curve. While the desired outcomes of the latter did benefit from those earlier noted 3 things, they had the extra challenge of requiring Skitter to make sense of, well, bug senses. As such, the quality of her hearing and seeing was most linked to the earlier idea of focus, in large part due to the effort required to piece together said inhuman senses into something useful. At least for the bug speech, it was just an exercise of using the sounds available. After all, it isn't an uncommon thing for a normal person to use relatively unrelated sounds to produce something familiar. By comparison, it's not exactly a common thing for someone to try to interpret a bug's senses. Anyway, I've been describing it as seeing through her bugs, but that is a bit of a misnomer, because as far as I found, what she saw was never truly equivalent to what a human would normally interpret it as seeing. It was less looking through bug eyes and more, as said before, an exercise of making sense of fuzzy and blurry sensory data. Initially, that is perhaps suboptimal, but with larger swarms comes more data, and paired with additional attention to her swarm, be it towards their actions and or location, also comes more context. And when taken all into account, she's able to create and use that earlier noted quote-unquote echolocation. She cannot see like a human, but she can take her ample amounts of clues and data to form a strong mental image, and visualize or map out her swarm's surroundings. In fact, there have been several cases where she was without sight, but with her swarm was still able to navigate relatively normally. I do have more to say on what else she did with that, let's say 6th sense, but that'll be for a later section. So, bug hearing, unlike bug seeing, is exactly what you think it is, and I'd say from what I know, it's also the one that showed the most notable improvement. To explain, her bug sight was, as previously stated, better described as her understanding the feedback she got from her bugs and turning it into a useful mental image. It was never truly human sight, outside of specific circumstances. In contrast, when Skitter began using her bugs to hear, her sounds degraded and became indistinguishable, weird, and irritating. At times, she could discern tone, and even deduce the origins of a sound. One time, she understood enough to know something was a recording, but even then she could not actually hear what was being said. However, later on, she did become able to hear through her bugs in the human sense. Though, to err on the side of caution, I will note that the example I'm mostly pulling from could be counted as an extended session rage situation. But based on other passages I've read, I believe my statement on how capable her bug hearing became is still accurate. That said, I'm more than willing to be proven wrong or be given clarification. Right. I'm done with all the technical details, so on to the fun tricks, tactics, strategies, and weaknesses. I'd say given previous content, one of the more interesting ways Skitter used her swarm was forming shapes. In basic description, they were a better version of Grue's shaped darkness, but instead of just being static shapes, Skitter's shapes and figures could move. As such, at least when it came to humanoid shapes, she could make more convincing decoys, especially when taking bug speech into consideration and the ways that can help sell the illusion. A related way Skitter utilized this general idea was her swarm clones. While not inherently used as a means of deception, she would at times form her swarm into a shape that would evoke her image or presence. Notably, she has used these extensions of herself as a way to coordinate affairs in several locations. Now, there were caveats. 1. While Skitter can have multiple active clones, she could not be fully present in each. She can have awareness in each clone, but could realistically only hear one conversation at a time. Given that, she would rapidly switch between clones instead of trying to hear everything simultaneously. 2. Because of the smaller swarm contained within her clones, her ability to hear and perceive things was also severely limited. But to overcome that issue, she would hide cameras and microphones in her clones, which inflated their true capabilities. Granted, at this point she was still developing her powers. 3. Due to said inexperience and smaller swarm, her generated speech was that earlier noted difficult and stilted kind. Though fair, it was good enough to coordinate with some additional help. Finally, Skitter plainly had comparatively better ways to communicate. Sure, there are benefits to communicating through something more human-like, such as a degree of personability. However, a big amorphous swarm provided clearer speech, and later on, better hearing, making the noted cameras and microphones less needed to not needed at all. Though I will mention that voice recognition on her part was still a bit of an issue. Continuing my point, if she needed to convey comparatively shorter or succinct messages, she could instead use her swarm to form words, sentences, and shapes in the air or on walls, which not only required less active focus, but was also quicker to do, and generally a better way to communicate with larger sums of people. There are plenty of other ways she used her power, but for my own sanity, and for the sake of not making Skitter's section even longer, I'll just list the ones I found to be most notable or interesting. To begin, more about her sixth sense. Since her swarm was functionally an extension of herself, when in sufficient numbers and or when placed in advantageous locations, Skitter acquired what could be considered a form of limited clairvoyance. In a broad sense, that may refer to the information she received from her seeing and hearing through her bugs. It can also relate to cases of her tracking people by hiding bugs on them, or just the general notion of her having bugs around her that allowed her to be very aware of her surroundings. Related to that, if there is one thing to link that clairvoyance to, it's how disturbances within her swarm gave her the ability to react just a bit quicker, lending further credence to the illusion of foreknowledge. In the same vein, that same sensory input also gave her enhanced aiming. Not to the same degree as people like Foil or Harbinger, but given all the data she got from her swarm, things like topography and the general layout of things, she could, in a sense, create an imaginary line that touched her target that she could aim along. It wasn't perfect, but it made her a more competent shooter than she otherwise would be. When it came to other, let's say, cool things she did, my favorite was when she learned Braille and then used her shared senses to read a bunch of things at the same time. Besides that, I think it was just fun to see the little things she did with her bugs, such as creating tripwires, having them make origami, using them to find and trip traps, having them carry matches for light, or using them to drown someone. The latter in particular being extra brutal if she's feeling extra aggressive. I imagine having spiders weave silk in your lungs is not the best experience. Well, to finish up, besides other parahumans and whatever powers they have, here are more accessible weaknesses. We have bug repellent and insecticides, results may vary. We have fire and water. We have Skitter being a normal, squishy human. And we have various uncontrollable things, such as bug availability depending on weather, season, location, and how she wanted or needed to be perceived by the public. Perhaps even money, under the idea that she may want to buy bugs that she would not normally encounter. So, with the leadership out of the way, I can move on to the other members of the core or original 5. As a palate cleanser for all the information of Skitter's section, I'll talk about Bix first, or Hellhound if you are so inclined, and her comparatively less complicated power. She was a striker, and while somewhat inaccurate, she was also classified as a master. More on that later, but to focus on the former, Bix had the ability to grow and augment dogs. Said growth came in the form of her generating masses of dead flesh from somewhere to envelop her dogs in, and depending on how much mass she added, she could modify how much more durable, strong, and agile they were. More mass made them hit harder and more durable. Durable enough to tank a lightning bolt from Behemoth. However, too much added would notably hinder how agile they could be. Besides that, the way the flesh grew around the dogs likely also helped in making movement more difficult. Essentially, the flesh did not just grow to create a larger version of the existing dogs. The added flesh made them quite monstrous. They would grow armor plating, horns, and spurs made of bone. Parts of their bodies also became exposed, calcified muscles. More so, a prehensile tail would form too, at some point. Keep in mind that external features were asymmetrical in their coverage, and while one can sensibly assume that the longer Bix augmented her dogs, that the more even the coverage would be, and perhaps the more durable and or thick the bones would be, I at the very least did not find information to definitively confirm or deny any of that. But based on information later, when it specifically came to bone coverage, the unevenness of it did seem to be a thing that Bix just had to work around. Some parts would always be seemingly less armored. Right. As far as striker powers go, Bix's was melee ranged. She could, within I'd say maybe 2 feet or 2 to 3 meters, empower her dogs. However, most of the time she would directly touch her dogs, both due to preference and due to something a bit later. But, before that, here are 2 things to know. First, as an extra benefit to help with her dog's durability, their transformation would make them significantly pain resistant. Not to the point that they would lose all sensations, they still had some, but enough that they could unflinchingly tank a multitude of attacks. Second, whenever the dogs are augmented, they would be healed. They would be purged of cancers, parasites, drugs, poisons, and diseases. Related to that, depending on how empowered they were, damage sustained while powered up would not reflect onto the dogs' base forms. However, in the case of the latter, enough damage can and will still kill the dogs even when powered up. So, to be honest, I did not find too much information about the healing aspect of Bitch's power. However, based on what I did find, what I stated earlier was true, but ostensibly only when the relevant injury or ailment wasn't too severe or far along. In one instance, one of Bitch's dogs had heartworm parasites that were too far along, and it took Skitter to get rid of them. In another instance, a dog was significantly crippled by Fog's mist. And while said dog probably would have otherwise died without the healing properties of Bitch's power, even after years of healing they were never able to walk the same, or move the same, and would also run out of energy quicker. Similar to all that, if a dog had an old wound that already healed naturally, said wound's condition would not be improved. Unrelated to healing, as far as I could determine, Bix could empower between 3 to maybe 11, maybe more dogs at a time. It was difficult to tell, to be honest, but I suppose it depended on how much she empowered them and how much energy she had left. What does that mean, one asks? Well, what a convenient segue of my own making. Though, before that, I'll quickly mention that she could easily and quickly purge the added flesh from her dogs, and that if she chose to leave it on and not maintain it, the flesh would eventually shed off on its own. Okay. When using her power, Bix felt an internal vibration that would then go out and reverberate with her dogs. These vibrations required a certain amount of energy from her, and depending on how it's done and what it's done on, the needed energy fluctuated. For example, she could choose how long it took to power up her dogs. She preferred to do it slowly and steadily because that way required less energy and may have given her more overall augmented dogs in the long run. However, if need be, she could also fully power up a smaller number of dogs over a significantly shorter span of time in exchange for a higher energy cost that would exhaust her if used too much. While this is an assumption, that may also have been the reason why she preferred direct contact. It required less energy. As for the comment about what she did it on, I am referring to how her power interacted with wolves and more wolf-like dog breeds. When augmenting the latter, the energy needed was less compared to ordinary dogs. The time it took to transform them was less too. More so, the transformed wolves themselves were sleeker, stronger, and had more symmetrical coverage with their bony add-ons. I don't know any more than that, and accordingly, if you're wondering, I don't know how her power would have worked on other canines. I'll finish off with her master classification. Simply put, Bix trained her dogs to listen to her commands, be they whistles or verbal commands or something else. And the PRT assumed that ability to command was due to some sort of master power, at least in part. Thus, the classification. To be fair, on the field, it did not really matter if she actually had a master power because functionally, Bix was a master. And it would be good to know regardless that when she's around, that there will be the potential of giant monster dogs. That said, the purity were technically not wrong. While it is true that she did not have a dedicated power that helped her control her dogs, her trigger event did kind of screw up her mind to make her better at innately understanding canines. However, it also made communication with other people notably more difficult in exchange. That altered mental state may have also made her resistant to certain master influences, but that's honestly just speculation. It's difficult to determine just how much her trigger contributed to the personality we see. Her existing personality could just be mostly attributed to normal childhood traumas. That was longer than expected, but on to the last of the five, Regent. He was a human-centric master, and his power can be categorized in two ways: the more practical and general use version and the advanced version. There isn't much to say about the former, but as far as most people knew, his power only allowed him to induce involuntary movements. Obviously, that can mean a lot of things, so here are some examples. I will note that inducing someone's gag reflex may still require the beginnings of a natural gag, or at least some degree of existing discomfort or pain in someone's throat to take advantage of. Similarly, if the latter is true, inducing a cramp may also require initial stimuli. As for its range, truthfully, I'm not fully certain of the specifics, but I found it to be relatively close. At least 10 meters or 33 feet, at most maybe 20 meters or 66 feet. But I don't know if I'm being too generous or too conservative with that quote-unquote max range. Not to mention, it's fair to state that what he's trying to do may also influence the range, along with his mental state. Now, the advanced version of his power can be interpreted as his true power. The short of it is that with long-term exposure, a few hours, maybe sometimes less, maybe sometimes more, and close proximity to a given target, Regent can map out and invade their nervous system. Once fully invaded, the control was functionally absolute, to the point that if he was controlling a parahuman, he could use their power. Though, to clarify, I have limited frames of reference for that particular part of his power, so I don't know how it translated to all other parahumans and their circumstances. Nevertheless, a good thing to know was that when he gave up control, the process of taking back control was quicker and easier, basically instant. And, if I understood it correctly, he also did not need to be nearly as close to reinitiate control. Now, to get something quick out of the way, Regent was able to control multiple people, and based on his thoughts, controlling 4 seemed like his limit. But from what I could determine, that may have related more to instances where he was actively controlling said people. So, I am unsure of how many more he could potentially control in cases where he had people do more low-effort actions, such as standing around somewhere or having them simply follow him. In fact, I am uncertain if my assumption about that 4-person limit is even necessarily correct. Granted, even if I am wrong in some way, I will still note it just in case. Okay, regardless of what the limit even was, he did have a limit. A limit he'd ostensibly reached enough times for him to internally comment on how controlling more people would deteriorate his and his puppet's functions. In the sense that both would have more awkward movements, slower reflexes, worse balance, and impaired speech. Outside of how many he was controlling, how far his puppets were for him, what he was doing, and what he had his puppets do were other factors that could have also led to diminished motor functions. As it were, there was a certain balancing act between all relevant factors that contributed to making Regent's power more or less of a chore. I'll highlight that when it was more of a chore, his ability to process things would become slower and harder, which would force him to divert significantly more focus onto his puppets to ensure that his control did not deteriorate, at least too much. That does lead to other issues, but I'll get to that later. Before that though, if it was possible, I would have given a range for Regent's puppeteering. However, there simply isn't enough information, or more specifically, there is information, but not quite enough to give any specifics, even ballpark ones. That said, take a look at these maps. The left is a canon map, and the right is a fan adaptation of the left with extra information taken from the story. I'm trusting that the creator for the right one did their research well enough, since their map will be helpful for the next part. Anyway, in one instance, Regent was puppeteering a parahuman located around upper downtown, near what I presume to be the lower southern docks area. At the time, Regent was at the Undersiders base, and from there his connection with his cape puppet was frayed to the point that he was having difficulties controlling his and his puppet's body. With that, I can only assume, barring the fact that he was heavily using his puppet at the time, that the noted areas of relevance were his approximate range. Evidently, that doesn't mean much without an actual distance scale. Sure, we do know that it took about half an hour to an hour to get from the docks proper to what I assume to be the downtown area. But once again, that still doesn't say that much since the canon map on the left doesn't clearly mark where areas truly end or begin. More importantly, we don't know the speed of travel. Not to mention both maps are depicting a city after a massive, let's say, natural disaster that likely significantly altered the geography of the area. All that in mind, forgive me for a bit of laziness, but if you really want a better mental image of how Brockton Bay could have been, in terms of size, among other things, along with some interesting information about geography and city planning, I'll have 2 links in the description, along with the maps. Moving on, to describe Regent's sensory feedback, it can be quickly described as the following. He acquired a general understanding of their fitness and health situation. He also viscerally experienced their feelings and body reactions. However, pain was notably distant and muted, possibly due to some instinctual defense mechanism, but equally and simultaneously possible because of his odd upbringing and or interference from his passenger. Now, besides the expected benefits that came from being able to impersonate someone, an interesting trick Regent could do was scale back control. That can mean several things, but I specifically refer to him letting a puppet's body autopilot itself. In combat, that can mean letting the body do what it knows and wants to do. Outside of combat, that can mean using that same muscle memory to feel out what felt right, to find stuff, or to input a correct password and the like. When it comes to weaknesses and such, there really isn't that much to say. First, as previously stated, when his control was deteriorating, he could force the connection to stabilize. But if he strained himself too much to maintain said connection, he could put his power out of commission. He could avoid that to some extent, but he would have to sacrifice some functions on either side. Second, certain parahumans that can induce a physical reaction onto someone can potentially disrupt Regent's control. Third, shape-shifting parahumans and those with irregular nervous systems may or may not cause issues. Lastly, while I don't think it's a legitimate concern given available information, it's probably still important to know that there is a possibility that those with a strong will could perhaps not break out of Regent's control, but at least in some way resist it. Though, to clarify, I'm basing this once again on one case where a puppet was feeling extremely intense emotions, and even then all that happened was some body shakes, tears in the eyes, and vocal tremors. Notable but altogether futile resistance, especially considering Regent, from what I could tell, was not really trying that much at the time to suppress his controlled body. So who knows if someone's willpower could actually influence anything in a significant way. To end this section, and the main meat of this video, I want to quickly mention a unique aspect of Regent's power. Basically, he was extremely resistant to the master powers related to Heartbreaker and his children, one example of the latter being Cherish. However, they were in turn also highly resistant to his power, and while all parties could overpower each other, it made them vulnerable, so it was a bit of a stalemate. An additional aspect of this interaction was Regent potentially also being resistant to other human-based master and master-like powers. For the latter, I'd say maybe powers like Gallant's Emotion Blasts or Glory Girl's Aura. For the former, maybe a power like Valaforce. But regardless, I do want to emphasize that this is once again speculation on my part, so take it as you will. Well, as a bit of fun, I'll talk about my icons for a bit. So, going in reverse, as you can see, I originally made an icon for Regent that more specifically referenced his taser scepter. However, when I went back to redesign it, a part of me felt like it needed more, so I added a rendition of his mask atop a new version of the scepter. Originally, for the third modification, I was going to add a bit more texture, let's say, or shading to the main white mask itself, but since I'm not a good artist, shading wasn't really an option. As for texture, I liked the contrast between the very plain white mask to the slightly more artistic gold eye details, so that kind of took texture out of the equation. However, what I eventually did settle on was adding some gold coloring on the gray coronet to break up the design. I do think it does need further modifications, but for now I'm satisfied, since I can't really think of anything at the moment. I really had no idea what to do for Bix in the original video, and it was much the same for this one too. I thought about maybe trying to make something related to Bix's transformed dogs, but I opted not to, mostly because I couldn't come up with a design at the time. So I just made one based on the types of masks Bix typically wore. Pretty similar to the original, but evidently I added some extra stuff to the final version to make it look more used. Which I suppose it would be, considering it is just a spray painted plastic mask that Bix got, or that Bix typically got from like a dollar store or something. Anyway, Skitter's icon was a case of it being exactly how I wanted it to be from the start. It's still my favorite icon of all the ones I've made. I'd say it was perfect before, with the slightly altered honeycombs and more importantly, the little added, I guess, highlights to the bugs really added that extra something for me. I may change the background color one day, but I don't think I'll ever severely redesign this. I could maybe try to have more detailed bugs or shade them to look more three-dimensional, but I feel that may ruin it. Something for another time. Obviously, I had even less of an idea of what to do for Tattletale, even compared to Bix's in the original video at least. Version 1 was pretty bad. Well, very bad. The second version, on the other hand, is a contender for my second favorite icon. Between the elements I carried over from the first icon and the other small bits like the dirt representing secrets, oh geez, so clever of me, along with the folder itself pulling it all together, I was extremely satisfied with how it turned out when I randomly decided to redesign it while doing art for another video. Now, for the third version, all I really did was put more obvious outlines on various things. I also redid the secret label a little bit, and the dirt a bit too. Basically just small things that bothered me, that most people would probably not notice, I guess. Grue's new icon was basically me attempting to do a rendition of his biker skull helmet. While it can still be better, when compared to the original icon, it's a notable improvement. So, like I said in the beginning, this was originally going to be about all the Undersiders I deemed to be relevant. However, while this one will still be long, the original version of this reached a length I found unpleasant to record and unpleasant to edit. Thus, like last time, Imp, Prine, and Foil will be in their own video. At least that's how I think it was last time. I could check, but yeah. If I commit to my current plan, the next video will probably come soonish, maybe next week, but probably a little later for my own sake. Oh, I'm probably also going to make a separate video about session ranges too. I think it's important enough to be its own mini video. Anyway, to those still here, subscribe, or not, do what you want. Goodbye, and see you again. When that will be, no idea.